cold steel locked around Mason Reed's wrists in a busy Chicago hotel lobby, while Amelia Brooks and dozens of stunned employees watched in silence. Two officers believed they had captured a dangerous attacker from the parking garage. Mason did not resist. He simply lowered his head, quietly hiding an old scar behind his collar. But when a senior police captain stepped through the doors and noticed a faded tattoo along his wrist, the captain's expression drained of color instantly. The man standing in handcuffs was no criminal. An entire naval fleet once called him a ghost no one could capture. The Brooks Meridian Hotel rose 38 floors above downtown Chicago, its glass face catching the gray winter light like a blade. Inside, the lobby gleamed with polished marble and fresh flowers, and a financial conference of enormous importance was only days away. Amelia Brooks walked through that lobby every morning as though she owned the weight of every tile beneath her heels. Because in every way that mattered, she did. She had inherited the hotel from her father 5 years earlier, and she had spent every one of those years trying to prove she deserved it. Lately, that proof felt harder to find. The hotel had suffered a string of security failures, sloppy reviews, and a persistent rumor that a rival investor wanted to buy the property out from under her. The board of directors had grown impatient, and Amelia knew that if the upcoming conference failed, she would lose more than her reputation. She would lose the only thing her father had ever left her. Mason Reed worked the night shift in the basement levels of that same building, fixing cameras, resetting electronic locks, and occasionally driving guests when the valet staff fell short. He was 34 years old, quiet in a way that made people forget he was in the room, and utterly unremarkable to anyone who did not look closely. He arrived early, stayed late when asked, never argued about pay, and never once raised his voice. Nobody on the management staff thought of him as anything more than a competent pair of hands who kept the building's machinery from falling apart. Amelia herself had passed him in the hallway a dozen times without learning his name, registering him only as the calm, low-ranking technician with eyes that never seemed to blink. What none of them knew was that Mason had once worn a far heavier uniform than the gray polo the hotel issued him. He had served as a Navy SEAL for over a decade, in places the public never heard about, doing work that left no paperwork behind. He had walked away from that life 2 years earlier, not because he had grown weak, but because he had grown tired of funerals. Now his entire world revolved around a small apartment, modest paycheck, and a daughter named Grace who needed a father more than she needed a hero. Every night before his shift ended, Mason called home to check on her, his voice softening into something almost unrecognizable from the discipline he carried on the hotel floor. He never spoke about his service to anyone at work. As far as the Brooks Meridian was concerned, he was simply the quiet man who fixed what broke. Logan Pierce, the head of hotel security, had never liked Mason much, though he could never quite explain why. Perhaps it was the way Mason noticed things other people missed, like blind spots in the parking garage cameras that Logan had conveniently never mentioned to anyone. Perhaps it was simply that Mason made him uneasy in a way he could not name. Logan kept his discomfort hidden behind a professional smile, the kind that fooled everyone except the people paying close enough attention. Amelia trusted him completely, in part because trusting him was easier than questioning the one department holding her crumbling hotel together. On the Tuesday before the conference, with executives and investors due to arrive within the week, Mason noticed something out of place in the VIP parking section. A black delivery truck, unmarked and unscheduled, had been parked in a restricted bay for nearly an hour. He logged it quietly, the way he logged everything, and continued his rounds without raising an alarm. It was a small detail, the kind most people would dismiss as nothing at all. But Mason had spent years learning that the world rarely announced its dangers loudly. It simply waited, parked in plain sight, for someone careless enough to ignore it. 2 days later, Mason was reviewing the parking garage feeds when he saw 3 men he did not recognize entering the restricted technical corridor near the electrical panels. They moved with the kind of practiced ease that told him immediately they were not lost guests or confused vendors. He radioed Logan at once, reporting the intrusion and asking for backup before approaching. Logan's response came back flat and dismissive, telling him to stay out of the VIP wing because Amelia was entertaining a delegation of early investors upstairs and could not afford any disruption. Mason hesitated only a moment before deciding he could not simply ignore 3 strangers near a panel that controlled half the building's locking mechanisms. When he reached the corridor himself, he noticed something else wrong. One of the cameras covering that section had been manually disabled rather than malfunctioning, its small indicator light dark in a way that no software glitch could explain. He moved quietly toward the electrical room, the old instincts returning to his body before his mind had even finished processing the danger. Inside, the three men had pried open a secondary panel and were rigging a device meant to disable the building's lock system and trigger a false fire alarm during the height of the conference. Mason recognized the wiring pattern immediately. It was sabotage, not theft. He tried to avoid a confrontation, calmly telling the men to leave the restricted area before anyone called real security down on them. One of the men turned with a short blade already in his hand, while another circled toward Mason's blind side, clearly expecting an easy target in a hotel uniform. What followed lasted less than 8 seconds. Mason disarmed the man with the blade using a controlled wrist lock, redirected the second attacker into a concrete support beam without breaking anything beyond his pride, and left the third standing frozen, unwilling to test his luck. No real damage was done to anyone, and Mason made sure of that deliberately, even as adrenaline screamed through his blood for the first time in 2 years. What he did not know was that Logan, listening on the radio the entire time, had already placed a call to the police, describing an unprovoked assault on a guest by a hotel employee. A second camera, one Logan controlled the angle of, captured only the moment Mason subdued the men, conveniently missing the blade, missing the wiring, missing every piece of context that mattered. Upstairs, Amelia received word that violence had broken out in her parking garage only minutes before her most important investors were scheduled to tour the property. Her stomach dropped with a fear that had nothing to do with the men involved and everything to do with the fragile reputation she had spent years protecting. Mason gathered the hard drive containing the unaltered footage himself, intending to bring it straight to Amelia before anyone else could shape the story first. He moved quickly through the service corridors, the device tucked under his arm like the only proof of his innocence he would ever need. He had no way of knowing that police cars were already pulling into the front drive, summoned by a man who had every reason to make sure the truth never reached the surface. As Mason stepped into the elevator that would carry him up to the main lobby, he had no idea that the next few minutes would strip away the quiet, unremarkable life he had worked 2 years to build. The elevator climbed slowly, each floor chiming past in a rhythm that felt strangely peaceful compared to what he had just left behind in the garage. He checked the hard drive once more, making sure the housing was secure, running through in his mind exactly how he would explain the wiring and the blade to Amelia without sounding like a man trying to excuse his own actions. He thought briefly of Grace, of the promise he had made himself never to bring violence home with him again, even in memory. For 2 years he had measured his success not in medals or commendations but in ordinary evenings, in homework finished and dinners eaten on time. Whatever happened next, he told himself, he had done nothing wrong down in that garage, and the footage in his hands would prove it the moment someone bothered to look. Officer Hunter Blake strode into the lobby first, young and certain of himself in the way only a handful of years on the force could produce. He spotted Mason near the elevators, still holding the hard drive, and ordered him to drop to his knees in front of dozens of guests and staff who had gathered at the commotion. Mason calmly explained that he had evidence in his hands proving exactly what had happened in the garage, but Hunter barely registered the words. Logan had already reached the officers minutes earlier, painting a picture of an unstable employee with a history of unauthorized access to restricted areas, and that story had arrived first, which meant it arrived loudest. Amelia emerged from the conference room just as the scene reached its peak, her makeup still fresh from greeting investors, her schedule still running on the assumption that today would be the day her hotel finally turned a corner. Instead, she found Mason kneeling near the elevators, his uniform dusted with garage grime, his expression unreadable in a way that struck her as cold rather than composed. Logan stepped beside her immediately, voice heavy with manufactured disappointment, claiming Mason had a temper problem and had been caught sneaking into camera rooms before. Amelia, exhausted and frightened for everything she had built, chose in that moment to believe the story that required the least imagination. Mason did not raise his voice or fight the narrative forming around him. He simply looked at Amelia and told her, quietly enough that only she and the nearest officers could hear, that she needed to review the hard drive before signing anything that night. To Amelia's ears, shaped by fear and exhaustion, the sentence landed as a threat rather than a warning. She gave the order to cooperate fully with police and suspend Mason from his duties effective immediately, the words leaving her mouth before she had time to consider any version of events beyond the one already in front of her. Hunter clicked the handcuffs shut around Mason's wrists right there in the lobby, the metallic sound carrying further than it should have in a room built for marble silence. Several employees turned away rather than watch, while others whispered to one another that they had always sensed something unsettling about the quiet man from maintenance. Mason lowered his head, not from shame over anything he had done, but from the particular ache of being judged before anyone had asked him a single real question. He had survived ambushes in places with no names on any map, yet nothing had prepared him for the simple, public humiliation of being condemned by people who had never bothered to look past his uniform. As the officers led him toward the doors, Mason caught sight of a man standing near the edge of the lobby, watching with the faint, satisfied smile of someone whose plan was unfolding exactly as designed. Jason Cross adjusted his cufflinks and said nothing, content to let the chaos do the work he had paid handsomely to set in motion. Mason filed the man's face away with the same precision he once reserved for targets in briefing rooms half a world away, though he said nothing about it then. Just before he was guided through the revolving doors, Mason turned his head slightly toward Amelia one final time. In a voice too calm for the situation, he told her that if the locking system on the 38th floor failed within the next hour, she should not trust the man standing beside her. Amelia opened her mouth to respond, but the doors had already swallowed him into the gray afternoon light, leaving her standing in a lobby gone suddenly, uncomfortably silent. The interrogation room at the precinct smelled of stale coffee and old paint, a fluorescent light humming overhead in a way that would have unsettled most people after the day Mason had endured. Hunter sat across from him, still convinced he was looking at a disgruntled employee who had finally snapped under pressure and wanted attention from his employer. Mason asked for only one thing, calmly and without repeating himself twice, that someone review the hard drive he had carried out of the garage before any charges moved forward. Hunter assumed the request was a stalling tactic, the kind of thing guilty men invented when they ran out of better excuses, and he leaned into a series of sharp accusatory questions meant to provoke a reaction. Mason gave him none. His breathing stayed even, his shoulders relaxed in the particular way of someone who had once been trained to remain still under conditions far worse than a poorly lit room and an impatient young officer. It was a stillness that unsettled Hunter more than any outburst could have, though he could not have explained why if asked. Captain Carter Hayes arrived not long after, summoned by a brief report that had crossed his desk almost by accident. He had served in the Navy himself decades earlier, long before trading one uniform for another, and something about the case file nagged at him in a way paperwork rarely did. He stepped into the room intending only a routine check, his manner brisk and professional, until his eyes settled on the faint scar curling behind Mason's collar and the edge of a weathered tattoo just visible beneath his rolled sleeve. Carter asked a question that had nothing to do with the garage, the hotel, or anything in the official report. He spoke a single old call sign, a designation from a campaign that had never appeared in any newspaper, watching closely for a reaction. Mason went silent for several long seconds before answering with a short, precise phrase that confirmed everything Carter needed to know. The temperature in the room seemed to shift entirely. Carter ordered the handcuffs removed at once, though Mason quietly asked that they remain in place until the footage had been reviewed properly, unwilling to let his own comfort interfere with the process of clearing his name through evidence rather than reputation. Hunter watched the exchange with growing confusion, unable to understand why his captain's entire posture had changed in the space of a single sentence he hadn't understood. Carter pulled aside the department's records and confirmed within minutes what his instincts had already told him. Mason Reed was a retired Navy SEAL, a man who had spent more than a decade participating in operations too sensitive to ever appear in any public account, including hostage rescues that had quietly saved lives no headline ever credited him for. Mason offered no embellishment when Carter asked him gently about his service. He said only that he did not wish to discuss the past, that he was simply a father trying to hold together an ordinary life after years of carrying an extraordinary one. There was no bitterness in his voice, only a tired kind of honesty that made the claim impossible to doubt. Before Carter could say anything further, his phone rang with an urgent call from the Brooks Meridian, a panicked voice reporting that the locking system on the 38th floor had failed exactly as Mason had warned less than an hour earlier. Carter looked across the table at Mason, who had not moved, had not gloated, had not even raised an eyebrow at being proven right so quickly. There was something almost unsettling about a man who could predict disaster with that kind of precision and still sit calmly waiting for the world to catch up to him. Hunter finally found his voice. asking quietly whether they should release him immediately given the new information. Carter nodded once, already reaching for his jacket, already understanding that the night ahead would require far more than a routine report and a closed file. Back at the Brooks Meridian, the conference floor had descended into quiet chaos. The 38th floor sat locked from the inside, elevators stuttered between levels without warning, and a false fire alarm shrieked through the hallways at the worst possible moment, just as the most important investors of the year began wondering whether they had chosen the wrong hotel for their business. Amelia stood in the security office watching the cascading failures on a bank of monitors, Mason's final words replaying in her mind with an insistence she could no longer dismiss as coincidence. She turned toward Logan, intending to ask for an explanation, and noticed for the first time how carefully he avoided meeting her eyes. He spoke quickly, suggesting that Mason likely had accomplices working from outside, perhaps even orchestrating this very failure as revenge for his suspension. The explanation, which might have satisfied her only hours earlier, now sounded thin and rehearsed in a way she could not ignore. Amelia demanded full access to the original camera footage from earlier in the day, only to discover that several crucial segments had already been deleted from the primary servers. A young technician, nervous and unwilling to be blamed for the gap, admitted that only Mason had ever set up a secondary backup system months earlier, precisely because he had not trusted the primary servers to remain secure under pressure. Amelia felt something cold settle in her stomach as the technician pulled up the backup files that existed only because a man she had just had arrested had quietly prepared for exactly this kind of failure. Shame arrived before clarity did. Amelia thought of Mason kneeling in her lobby, of the calm, almost gentle warning he had given her on his way out the door, and she realized with sickening certainty that she had dismissed the one person who had been trying to protect her hotel from the very beginning. She called Carter directly, her voice tighter than she intended, demanding to know where Mason had been taken and whether he was being treated fairly. Carter's tone on the other end of the line was measured but pointed. He told her that Mason was not the man she believed him to be, though he stopped short of revealing details that remained sealed under decades of military confidentiality. Something in his restraint told Amelia that whatever truth she was missing ran far deeper than a simple misunderstanding about a parking garage altercation. She left the hotel within minutes, abandoning a conference floor still in disarray to drive across the city herself. At the precinct, she found Mason seated calmly, the red marks of the handcuffs still visible along his wrists, his posture as composed as it had been hours earlier in her lobby. She tried to offer an apology, the words tumbling out faster than she had planned, but Mason simply told her that her hotel was still in danger and that apologies could wait until the danger had passed. Before she could respond, Carter pulled her aside and told her something that reshaped everything she thought she understood about the quiet maintenance technician she had ordered arrested that afternoon. Mason Reed, he explained, was the kind of man governments called when every other option had already failed. Amelia stood in the hallway outside the interrogation room for a long moment after Carter walked away, trying to reconcile the image of the silent technician who fixed her cameras with whatever lay behind that single sentence. She thought back over every interaction she had ever had with Mason, searching for clues she had been too distracted to notice, and found only a man who had never once asked for recognition, never once raised his voice, never once given her any reason to suspect there was more beneath the surface than a steady, careful employee doing his job. The realization that she had built an entire judgment of his character on nothing more than his job title left her unsettled in a way she had not expected. Carter returned to the interrogation room with a thin folder, the minimal portion of Mason's record he was permitted to share under the rules that still governed such things years after a man's service ended. It confirmed that Mason Reed had belonged to an elite Navy SEAL unit, deployed on operations involving hostage rescues in international waters, missions so sensitive that most of the official paperwork remained classified even from local police departments. Hunter, standing near the doorway, felt his stomach drop as he realized the man he had marched through a crowded hotel lobby in handcuffs was someone trained at a level few people in that building could even imagine. Mason did not preen under the revelation. If anything, he seemed faintly embarrassed by the attention, his voice flat as he told Carter that none of those old titles helped him pay rent or gave his daughter a more peaceful father at the end of the day. Amelia, listening from a chair near the wall, found herself struck by the plainness of the statement. She had spent her entire career surrounded by men who treated power as currency to be spent loudly and often, and here was a man who had access to more legitimate power than any.